Hello, everyone. Good to see you tonight on this Friday night. Kind of late. I actually wanted to come on and talk about this a little bit earlier with you, but so many things happening as we learn today that, yes, in fact, Dylan Mulvaney and Bud Light are over. How do you like that? I mean, like officially over. They are over, you see, because, well, sales have been plummeting. You know that story. But I wanted to share with you this. The CEO, Michael DeCaris, he told investors that Anheuser-Busch is, over. It's done. The relationship was short and filled with turmoil, but it's over. In other words, he has recognized apparently that this is not a good way to go. He did say we want to clarify that this was just one influencer. So one campaign, one influencer, and it's done. But is it? Right? Like, who is ever, I just have to ask you guys, are you ever going to get that image, right? The image out of your head. I mean, think about every time somebody offers you a Bud Light, like you just can't help yourself, skills, right? This is what you will see. So the company's doing, of course, the right thing for the company and the right thing for shareholders. I have to turn me down here, but the right thing for shareholders, they have to do it. But I'll tell you, shareholders aren't buying it. They're not buying it because the stock has still not recovered. All right, I'm looking at the stock price right here, and it's trading around $64 a share. You think, oh, okay, that's fine, right? It was up around 67 and change before all this happened, so it lost about $3. Who cares? We're talking billions of dollars because this is a company that is so heavily traded. In other words, this is a company that is looking at a pretty serious market cap. So when it loses $3 a share, you're talking about billions of dollars. And so it's just sort of shocking. Yes, I am really here. David Logan asking. I am really here. You know what? This was important enough to you guys. I got to say, I was just amazed at the outpouring. Like, you've all been telling me these great Anheuser-Busch Bud Light stories, like the first time you ever had your first Bud Light. And, you know, everybody has such a history with the company. And that's totally what Anheuser-Busch totally forgot. By the way, it's, we talk about it being an American company. I just want to be just up front. Like, it's a Brazilian company and a Belgian company. They bought AB InBev, right? They did this merger with AB Anheuser-Busch. So it was like a $52 billion merger. And now it's really just a multinational conglomerate that moved its headquarters, U.S. headquarters, from St. Louis to New York City, Chelsea, actually. And hey, look, here's the result, right? And I think that all of us have sort of been like, wow. I mean, can you imagine? I've been asking you guys, what do you do, right? If you're on a date and somebody's like, you know, or like if you're not on a date, let's just say you're, you know, a couple going out to dinner and somebody orders a Bud Light. I mean, like, I was at a restaurant the other day and the waiter came over and was reading off the beers. And I'm like, oh, please, like, I'm just waiting for it, right? And it's like that cringeworthy moment. I don't think this beer is ever going to be able to recover from that. I mean, do you? I'll ask you what you think. MJ, good to see you here. Dylan is like a can of Bud Light you pick up at a party. Oh, wow. All right. And find out after a sip that it had, oh dear. Okay. Okay. You'll have to like look at the comments to see the rest of that one. Michael, good to have you here. Keith, good to have you here. Really wonderful to see you all tonight. I like doing these live Q&As because it's just a chance for us to all connect in a meaningful way over these crazy stories. You know, normally, like, I wouldn't care, but like, it's just reaching a tipping point. I sound like Lori Lightfoot. She said that, a few hundred immigrants there in migrants there in Chicago, that has actually caused her to have this tipping point. This stuff on a cultural level is reaching a tipping point. Americans, we are a very accepting bunch. You know that. We are a very kind group of people, but when you push us, like, come on, like, you can only push us so far. And this is a great example of it. I like seeing how people just kind of vote with their feet or with their dollars. I mean, this is a great example of that. You look at the sales numbers down 26% on the heels of down 21%, and that was the week before they were down 17%. Interestingly, Coors Light, like, they're benefiting big time. Like, their sales are way up. So Molson Coors shares, well, they've been doing pretty well. That was kind of the obvious trade, I guess, on that one. Hang on just a second. So you know this is live. See, I'm getting my drink of water here. Anyway,
win some money too.
Yeah, it's wild. And then if you look at this particular actor, Dylan Mulvaney had a whole shtick going on and really is like that kind of personality. And it seems to a layperson, and by the way, I think I would be joined by many members of Dylan's community. I don't think they appreciate this either, right? Because they're sitting there going, wait a second, like he's Johnny come lately or Holly go lightly because this is a new thing. Well, it was a disaster for Bud. It will go down in the history books. I love this, right? Because everybody there at AB InBev, they all went to Harvard, where they're supposed to have this great business school and a great, case set that they can look at, a case study, and you like see what not to do. It's kind of like, it's a different version of, I remember when the CEO of Lululemon was actually on television with me on Bloomberg television. And he came on and he had this huge scandal going on with the yoga pants because it apparently got like see-through, and women were complaining because you could see like a whole lot going on down under. And so I just asked him, hey, like what's going on with the pants? And he had a lot to say. He actually said it was women's fault that the pants were that way, and that, their bodies just weren't made for them. Well, you can imagine the uproar. Like women went crazy. He, unfortunately, that's an example of cancel culture from way back when. He unfortunately lost his position. I felt really bad for him. I didn't think he would say that, and I didn't think it would get so picked up by the media, but there was this sort of boycott. He wound up out of the company, a company that he had founded, by the way. But I compare and contrast it with Bud Light. I think that, consumers are just like, enough. I would like to know where the women are. I have not seen, in my estimation, frankly, enough women come out and be upset at all by this. You consider the Nike example, and I would just say, hey, it's not easy running with, womanly parts. And yet this actor who doesn't have those parts, clearly hasn't completed the whole transition, like is somehow now trying to sell a sports bra. It's so wild right now. And I'm going to get to sort of the implications of what it means, because we can talk about it, we can laugh about it, we can get angry about it, but there are real implications for society. This is like out of nowhere, and yet it's not. It's been kind of bubbling up over the years, I think, sort of being perpetuated maybe in academic circles. And there's this extremist, like a few years ago, anybody would have said, this is nuts. Like everybody knows, man, woman. Maybe there are some people that are struggling with this, but for the most part, it's like 0.01% of the population. And now you go around and wow, it's like a regular thing. And so years ago, you could have been a hippie, and now you have gender dysphoria. And I question where that's taking us, where it's taking our society. I have some sound I want to play for you, because this is actually a big deal, guys. Again, we can kind of look at this and say, wow, that's one little thing, one outlier. We were upset, we're mad. But this is like happening all across society right now. And that's probably a bad thing. Hey, did you see the Navy recruiter? I got to show you guys. You probably saw this. This is wild. Take a look at the picture. So apparently, this is who's recruiting people for the Navy, because, recruiting's down. So they got to do something about it. This is just weird, right? Come on. I'm so getting over this. I'm curious to know what you guys, somebody has some investing questions. I'm glad you have some investing questions, Jake, because actually, as we talk about, we're going to get to the default in just a moment, as we think about what's going on socially and we combine that with what's going on economically. We really are looking at some problems coming up. I'm actually going to have a guest tonight, Hans Humes. He is the CEO of Greylock Capital. He's looking at it from the perspective of what would it mean really if the U.S. were to default on our debt? And hint, it's not good. All right, it's really and truly not good. That would be that would be quite a legacy for Joe Biden to have. My gosh, it would be a disaster. For sure. And Hans's point, and he'll talk about this himself, is just sort of that we need to be cautious because there are countries all around the world that want to effectively weaponize that, right? They want us to default, and then they could replace us as the world's reserve currency. So these are real issues. Everybody's weighing in on this picture. This picture is just The picture says it all. I really can't believe it. Apparently, the U.S. Navy, this is according to a report, and this picture, by the way, is from Daily Mail. The U.S. Navy has chosen a person that is a drag queen to somehow recruit more people to be in the Navy. I mean, like, wow. China, here we are. Like game over. Like it's over. Don't forget, China has a very male population. For years they had that one child rule, and there were a lot of baby girls that lost their lives as a result of that. Really, really sad stuff. And they're left with a dominantly male population. So there's no sort of female, and I say that female, right, to kind of even out some of that testosterone that's going to be out there in China. And so you think about what's going on here. We've got almost this like feminization, right, of men. And then over in China, they've got the opposite. That can't be good. And if you think about it from a historical perspective, trying to see if I have Camille Paglia here for you. If you think about it from a historical perspective, this is really, really, really bad stuff. I want to share with you, some of you who listen to the podcast regularly, you may have heard me play some of this before. This woman is a very liberal feminist who maybe is so liberal, she's now like coming full circle. I don't know. But she made the point as far back as 2016 that we are at risk of something really bad. When you have this much, sort of feminization of men and this much confusion over who we are. I mean, like, you don't even know if you're male or female? Come on. Like, if you don't know that, like, how do you know yourself at all? How does a society know itself? It's crazy. John, I had never heard of Dylan either. John writing in that he had never heard of Dylan before this whole Bud Light fiasco. I had not heard of him either at all, but now he's sort of come into the mainstream world, and he keeps getting more deals. I mean, Maybelline is advertising his, he's got an advertisement for Maybelline, the makeup. And I used to use their eyeliner and their foundation. I'm like, So Maybelline's one, Nike's one. The guy's like cleaning up. It's really, really pretty darn wild. And somebody's asking, AB says that they've only lost 1% in global sales. Here's what you need to know. This is like one of the biggest beer companies in the world. So with that in mind, I'd recommend you do your research, because there's a whole lot of brands over there at AB InBev, right? You can just go down the list. I mean, Bud Light's nothing. Someone told me the other day, well, just so angry about this. And this guy, he loved Bud Light, loved it. It was like all he'd ever drunk his entire life. And he is so hurt by this. He's like, I can't drink it. I just can't possibly drink it. And he switched, he said, to Mick Ultra. Lower carbs, I guess. Worse taste, if that can even possibly be imagined. But here's the thing. Mick Ultra is still Anheuser-Busch. So you've got to actually, I think as a consumer, start to say, wait a second, what do I really want? Maybe it's better to, support a local brewery. Anheuser-Busch used to be a local brewery before it got bought by the Brazilians for $52 billion and became a multinational conglomerate with headquarters over there in Brussels. U.S. headquarters moved out of St. Louis into New York City. You've seen the commercials. They're like desperately trying to get everybody back. And people are like, sorry, I don't buy it. I don't believe it. And the CEO can go on an earnings call and say, you know what? It was just this one influencer, just this one spot, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's kind of like game over. I don't think this beer is coming back. Tell me if you agree, disagree. I'm just curious because it's wild. Northeast Ohio. John, good to see you there in Northeast Ohio. Gary, hey, good to have you here. What is my schedule on YouTube? Good question. I typically, just so you guys all know, I typically record the show. And then you see it later. And then sometimes I'm just like, you know what? To heck with it. Let's just do it live. Let's do it live, right? It means that, you You hear a little bit more of those ums, and you see me like taking a drink of water every now and then. Because, I don't have the commercials like I did on TV. Not the same kind. Not when we're live anyway. We're just live streaming. And I love hearing from you. I feel like we have a connectivity that we didn't, or we don't really have when it's not live. But I'm going to try and get a schedule. Maybe like, what do you think? 1 o'clock? Maybe we could do this like at 1 o'clock every day. Would that work for everyone? Would it work for me? I think it might. I mean, 1 o'clock would be good. Certainly would beat 10:35 at night on a Friday, but it's good to see you. It's good to see you. Okay, so we still have a whole lot more to talk about because your reaction there to Miss Navy, I'm sorry. Like, hey, I sent it to one person who is in the military or was in the military and wrote back with a picture of how to speak Mandarin, learn to speak Mandarin. In other words, the point being, we're all going to be speaking Mandarin if this is what we care about more than actually really the strength of our military. Consider what Jennifer Granholm was saying the other day. Jennifer Granholm, our energy secretary, who's obsessed with making sure that we have green energy vehicles all over the world for our military. Like, so your Humvee is going to be green. It's an EV. Like, I don't know how that's going to work, right? Like, you get a charging station everywhere. Is that the idea? We're going to build out charging stations so our military can handle this. I mean, it is really kind of nuts. Again, I'm just looking through your questions. A lot of you like gold. Full disclosure, one of our wonderful advertisers is legacypminvestments.com. You can buy and sell gold there at legacypminvestments.com. Gold has obviously been trending higher because I think there is just so much uncertainty out there. So certainly in play, especially as we come up right on this debt ceiling, and nobody seems to want to have the conversation that needs to be had, which is you need to stop spending. How can no one understand this? I really would like to know. They are so wedded to their pet projects and to this idea that you just need to spend, that you are going to have a really bad inflationary type scenario. The reason this, again, is important as we look at this Navy girl right here is that this is not good news for a civilization. I want you to hear Camille Paglia, as I said, noted feminist, talking about the issue. Take a listen and we'll weigh in. You can write in and tell me what you think as you hear it. This is something else.
Now, I began all of my studies, my book, Sexual Personae, began as a dissertation at Yale graduate school on androgyny. I've always been fascinated, attracted to the subject of androgyny, and that's what sexual personae is. I explored it in history. But the more I explored it, I realized that, that historically, the movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture, okay, as a civilization is starting to unravel, okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history in the Greek art, okay, you can see it happening. All of a sudden, okay, there's a kind of there's the sculptures of handsome nude young men athletes that used to be very robust, okay, in the archaic period suddenly began to seem like wet noodles, okay, toward the end, okay, and that the people who live in such periods, a late phase of culture, whether it's the Hellenistic era, whether it's the Roman Empire, whether it's the Mauve decade of Oscar Wilde in the 1890s, whether it's Weimar Germany, people who live at such times, okay, feel that they're very sophisticated, they're very cosmopolitan, okay, homosexuality, heterosexuality, so what, anything goes, and so on, all right, and so, but from the perspective of historical distance, okay, you can see that it's a culture that no longer believes in itself, okay, and then what you invariably get are people who are convinced of the power of heroic masculinity, okay, on the edges, whether they're the Vandals and the Huns, okay, or whether they're the barbarians of ISIS. Okay, you see them,
Okay, this is very important. You heard what she was saying. Like, we are actually really and truly at risk of something here. I mean, this is perplexing to me that it's all happening right now. And so I've been just like, as a student of history, trying to like go and figure out, like, has this ever happened before? And if you listen to Camille, I mean, she points out that yes, indeed, there is this kind of change in even the art that you can see in all these various times. And then, people look at sort of the 1890s, the decadence of the Oscar Wilde time and the literature, of that particular time period. And then you think about what was going on in sort of Germany prior to World War II. And I was reading some very interesting historical accounts of that, with gender identity being in question. And so when all these things are in question, there are other problems that come about as a result. And Dinesh D'Souza, my friend Dinesh D'Souza, who has the Dinesh D'Souza podcast. We were talking about this, in fact, on just yesterday's program. And I want to play you a clip right here of Dinesh and myself getting into this, because he's got some very good points. I mean, it's concerning as a civilization.
He's the greatest Muslim historian of the Middle Ages. And he said all civilizations go through a period. He kind of compared it to the human growth. So you begin as a child, the civilization is in infancy, it's developing its basic principles. Then you have the strength of adolescence and youth, in which the civilization is vigorous. And then he says over time, the civilization becomes kind of unsure of itself. It begins to lose strength and it goes into a sort of decay. And of course, his focus was about why that happens. Now, I think what Kamil Paglia is saying is that the reason it happens is that when the civilization loses its sense of itself, it becomes confused, and all the principles that seem to be certainties before now become, well, I don't really know. So you become a relativist of a sort, and the relativism then suddenly begins to become so pervasive that you can't tell the difference between a man and a woman, which is an extreme form of relativism, right? It's one thing to say, for example, I don't know about the existence of, platonic verities in the sky. It's another thing to say, I don't know about the existence of a tree outside my window. So the difference between men and women is as obvious as the existence of a tree. Why? Because no one comes into the world kind of unsexed, right? You come to the world and you don't even really have human beings, right? You have men, you have boys, and you have girls, and that's all you have. You don't have any. You might have a few people who have some intermediate sexual condition, the hermaphrodites and so on, but those are very minor. And so there's no such thing as human beings outside of this given biological framework. And I think what she's saying is when you start questioning even that, then you are kind of in civilizational la land. So I think, and then she traces the decadence of the late Romans, the decadence of Weimar Germany. Certainly there was a lot of nihilism.
Yeah. And so he goes on, and you should listen to the whole conversation, because Dinesh is, one of the smartest thinkers really out there. And he's a historian of sorts, and just such an avid reader and student of history and philosophy and all those good things. So if you take a historical perspective, this isn't good. Like, this is definitely not good. And the result could indeed be this kind of hypercharged masculinity as the other thing, right? The other thing that's out there. So what I wish the left would start to understand, what I wish Joe Biden would start to understand, is that what they're doing is not right. It makes absolutely no sense. The idea that somehow, a young girl is supposed to be competing in a swimming race with somebody who was born as a man and thus has all this testosterone. I mean, come on, like that. It's beyond comprehension that we even have to have these conversations. Like, I can't believe, I remember, I'll tell you guys, back when I was at Fox. Oh, we got to talk about Tucker. Any theories on that one? I mean, I have a few theories, none of which are terribly informed. I'm just looking at it going, But back when I was at Fox, I'm going to write that down. We're going to talk about Tucker. When I was back at Fox, I remember maybe in 2016, 2017, my producer wanting to do this story, and we were talking about it. It was because, they suddenly wanted men who identified as women to be able to use the restrooms wherever they wanted to in New York City. And, it's concerning as a woman, as a mother, yeah, I don't like that idea. Do you like that idea? I'm sorry. You know what? The women's room is crowded enough. No, thank you. And we were looking at it as a story. We did do it. And I'm just like, wait a second. Is nobody thinking about the importance of women here? Where are the feminists trying to help the women? And we did it as a story. I didn't harp on it a lot. And you know that I actually haven't done this story a lot on this show up until quite recently because it is not right what's happening. And if we don't speak up, seriously, if we don't speak up, then somehow this is just okay. One of the things that Dinesh said to me, guys, is that, this is great. He's like, okay, so suppose I just identify as a toad one day and I say, I want to go and sleep with the toads and I want to eat with the toads, and you better accept me as a toad. And if you don't, like, I mean, where's this going in all seriousness? Like, just because you feel like something one day, just because you feel like it, you get to be it? I don't think so. You know, there should be certain certainties in life. And this is kind of one of the obvious ones. It just, you know, but why it's alarming is because when you think about how we don't believe in anything, you see how it's connected to the financial system. We don't believe in just being a man or a woman, that there's so many different genders out there. Then how are you supposed to believe that if you loan the US government money, that you'll get paid back? And by the way, like, it's kind of in question right now. I've never been so alarmed by this. I've never been so worried about this. I mean, we're going to be out of money, guys, in 3 weeks. And there's no willingness by the Democrats to actually say, okay, maybe we should cut some things. We've got all this discretionary spending. I mean, people talk about the divorce, right? The divorce in this country. It's like a household. And, you know, the one spouse wants to spend money. The other spouse is saying, wait a second, like, we have bills to pay. We just can't keep racking up debt. And oftentimes, like, marriages have been known to fall apart over things like money. We are married, right, in this country, and we have to come to some kind of solution on really important things like our budget. And we cannot spend. It's that simple. Like, families get this. Families get this. So why doesn't Biden get it? Why don't the Democrats get it? You know why? It's easy. It's easy to just keep spending money, and who cares? It's like monopoly. In fact, there was a congressman who's actually no longer in Washington, D.C., thank you, a Democrat who was head of the Financial Services Committee, I believe, and he actually said this. I'll have to dig that up. Maybe I'll play that for you over the weekend tomorrow, because it's just the most precious bite in the world. He's like, listen, we don't have to balance our checkbook. We have all the money. Like, we're like the banker in Monopoly. We have the money. We're the banker. You know, everybody else just plays the game with it. Well, yeah, okay, until they call your bluff and they're like, hey, you know what? We don't think you're going to pay this back. Maybe you don't pay it back. And at that point, you're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. So everything that we have sort of considered normal is being really destroyed right now. And that is a concern. I did mention, did I not, Tucker Carlson, Fox News, did you see the news about Geraldo, guys? Geraldo, what? He's not going to be on the 5 for like a whole week? I don't know what's going on there. Are they just like cleaning out everybody? The Tucker thing is still, you know, it's a pretty big deal. I question whether or not Fox is going to be able to recover in the ratings, but, you know, everybody's saying like, it was this, it was that, it was this, it was that. Maybe it was the text messages. Maybe he said bad things about employees. Maybe he said bad things about the family that owns the company. Or maybe, just maybe, Fox was worried about regulation. I mean, do not forget, what was it, 5 weeks ago? That Chuck Schumer was on the floor saying, we need to regulate Fox. We need to regulate. He specifically said Tucker Carlson. And AOC said, again, a similar thing on Sunday. So as a result, I would just question whether any of that pressure played into what they did. I have no inside knowledge. I do know that would be a concern. And you think about the Murdoch history, Sky News, and basically what transpired there with them not being able to get their $15 billion deal through because the Brits said, wait a second, you're not what we want, right? You're not fit. That was Ofcom, the regulatory agency there. So they might be saying that to themselves as well. I'm clearly in need of some water, so I'm going to play another bit of sound from Camille Paglia. I'd love to hear your reaction right here.
You're encouraged to think that it's an alienation is because you are not totally defined, identifying with your particular inherited gender definition. So I'm very concerned about this. I think that a lot of it, I think that the collaboration of the bureaucratic machinery with it has to do with the assault on masculinity. Okay. Okay. So you see, the gender doesn't really exist. It's not really polarity. I mean, everything's all about expanding women's rights, but also terminating men. Okay, and defining men out of existence. Masculinity is by definition toxic. Okay, masculinity doesn't exist. And you see, this is the proof of it. And now I began all of my studies. My book Sexual Personae began as a dissertation at Yale graduate school on androgyny. I've always been fascinated, attracted, to the subject of androgyny, and that's what the sexual persona is. I explored.
Yeah. And then we heard her go on about that. Thank you for humoring me, so I could get a little sip of water there. But indeed, it's reaching a point where I think that when our Navy is using this person, courtesy of the Daily Mail, to recruit because they can't find enough people. I mean, I'm sorry, but I don't know if this is going to win you any wars, guys. I really don't. And it's all happening again as we get closer to default. All right. I want to have an in-depth conversation about this default thing because it is a big deal. So I'm bringing on a friend of mine right now. And then on the other side of this, let's talk a little bit more about the Fox stuff because I do think they're going to have a lot of challenges. And again, if we look at it from a capitalist viewpoint and where the stock is trading and the fact that they had to pay the nearly $800 million, nearly $1 billion, to Dominion, and they still have Smartmatic in the works, it's really a matter of how does this company make it? I'm sure it'll be fine. It's big enough. It's diverse in that it has other things in its portfolio besides just Fox News. But this is certainly going to be a hit, and I think it's going to take a long time for viewers to recover. Don't forget Dan Bongino, too. Dan, he's just a wonderful guy, wonderful guy, and host of his own podcast, and I think is going to do a lot of great things independently. One of you was just mentioning the importance of being independent, and I'm here to tell you, I'm living proof. I'm watching this whole thing go, whew, I'm glad I'm not there anymore. For goodness sakes. I'm really, and I genuinely mean that. And I don't care. We've got a small little audience here on YouTube, very small, certainly compared to what I had on a national television platform. But you know what? I'm here talking to you, and I think that we're going to continue to grow this. By the way, if you haven't, do me the favor of subscribing, just because subscribe and hit the bell so that you know when I'm here live, especially, or when we're premiering a show, because it's important to get the word out. If you could, give a thumbs up, like it, share it. But I want to get to the interview right now because we've got to talk about default, and we've got to talk about the other actors out there. Right? Who are the other countries that would love to see this? And by the way, why isn't our military actually employing the tools of finance to help us succeed on an international level? They're just not. They don't understand it. That's what Hans is going to tell us. Hans Humes, they don't get it. We do not have smart enough people. I started my career, by the way, in sovereign debt markets. This is where, my first job was actually at Goldman Sachs. I was on the trading desk and we were making markets in Latin American emerging market debt because all of those countries basically, they issue debt just like we do. It's not like, it's not like our debt. It's kind of the Wild West. It was totally the Wild West. And we traded it and we made markets in it. And what has happened in that time is a whole lot of change. And the Russians, the Chinese, other people are getting really smart about how those debt markets work, and they're using it to their advantage. So Hans is going to tell us about that. And then, yes, we do need to talk about, I know that probably a lot of you won't miss Geraldo for the week, but it's just weird. What the heck is going on? I'm really kind of stunned by all of it. Joining me right now with a look at what it would really mean to default here in the U.S., as well as we're going to talk about what's going on internationally. My friend Hans Humes, he's the CEO of Greylock Capital. And let me just say, Hans, you have been to probably every hellhole on earth, and you have helped them sort of piece back their economy bit by bit after they have defaulted. So if there's one guy we need to talk to about what this would mean for the U.S., God forbid, it would be you. Good to see you.
It's always great to talk to you, Trish. I'm happy to be here.
So, I don't like talking about the threat of a U.S. default. I mean, it feels like it comes up almost every year, but right now it's feeling a little bit different. And I think that's just because of the sort of, the voraciousness, shall we say, on both sides of the aisle right now, where I'm like, okay, maybe somebody really could do something stupid. What would it mean if the U.S. defaulted on its debt?
Well, you sort of made a comment that I go into places and put the pieces back together, be it Greece or Argentina or even Russia in 1998. This comes apart, we default. There's no pieces that we're going to be putting back together. I mean, the U.S. is really different. We are the major center for financial transactions. The dollar is still the reserve currency. All the things, I mean, if you think of the financial system of being a matter of confidence, that people rely on certain totems of, underpinnings, pillars, there needs to be a common belief and a common trust. And if I was at a conference in Boston last weekend, and had sort of one of the speakers went through a history of how the U.S. put together the system that basically the world functions with now. If we defaulted, there's an incredibly high likelihood that the result wouldn't be the Great Depression. It would be far in excess of that. It would make the Great Depression look like a mild recession. So what we're playing with is actually, it's not, we can be very focused on our domestic, perspectives.
Right. Which will take you down the rabbit hole any day of the week.
Yeah, but you can also go down the rabbit hole in sort of this idea that money, credit, borrowing is reliant on a common belief of that these things have certain values. And if you pull this away, that the U.S. is sort of the center of this, mm-hmm. It's going to be catastrophic. I mean, there's no way around it. There's no pieces to put back together. So one, as a country, I think we need to look at this and say, hey, let's pay attention to these things rather than some of the other things that seem to chew up political discussions in our country. And secondly, keep an eye out for those international actors who really, if they can undermine us, they don't really care about the damage that it does to the rest of the world. It might play to their benefit.
Sure. I mean, and that brings us to China. It brings us to Russia. I mean, some of these countries that we are increasingly concerned about and increasingly have shown that they want to be, if you would, the hegemonic power of the world. A lot of people say, oh, why are we doing that? Well, why are we doing that? Because you know what, all those cheap goods that you get to buy at Walmart, or the fancy home that you get to build on a relatively low interest rate, which is now going up. But, a lot of that lifestyle comes from the fact that we are the world's reserve currency, which thereby sort of de facto makes us the hegemonic power of the world. So knowing that China wants to replace us long term, knowing that Russia just really doesn't like us, what do we need to be thinking about as these headwinds come our way? And what are they doing actively right now, from what you see in your world, to destabilize us?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. We have to sort of understand that we're not in 1993, right in the back of the Berlin Wall coming down, Russia trying to open, China really not being on the radar screen. And China does chew up a lot of rhetoric in DC around their participation in the financial markets. And in my world, they've been a big lender to emerging market countries. They've been an alternative source of funding for African countries that are actually important to us, certainly in Latin America, which is in our hemisphere. We get displaced quite often. And then on the policy side, there's a ton of focus on the Chinese being a primary lender. And, just to explain the difference between primary lending and then the secondary markets, the primary lending is the Chinese lend in the bond markets, let's say. I'll take it to our thing. If a country issues bonds in our market and I buy the bond, I'm giving $1 of my money to the country, they'll pay me back the dollar with the interest rate. After that happens, we have a secondary market where people buy and sell it. And when countries get into distress, it trades at a big discount. So we're doing a pretty good job on in the headlines, looking at China from the point of view of being a primary lender. Now, where Russia is, we're seeing them as a political opponent. But somehow or another, the people in DC don't understand in the secondary market, there's a channel where a country can go in through fronts in countries where a lot of Russian money has been flowing into to get involved in the secondary markets. So they buy the country's bonds like Ghana, Venezuela, Sri Lanka to some extent at a big, big discount where they get the same rights and obligations as you do by lending 100 cents in the dollar.
So I'm going to break it down just for a second. Right. So in layman's terms, I mean, and look, I started my career in sovereign debt markets at Goldman Sachs, as you know, and sometimes the viewers remember. But anyway, just to kind of just simplify it, it's like, remember in 2008, we learned a lot about secondary debt markets, right? Because people were like, wait a second, my mortgage isn't held by Bank of America? No, because what happened was Bank of America issued the mortgage and then it's traded and retraded in what's known as the secondary market. So what you're referring to, Hans, and by the way, Hans is like the guy. I call you sort of like the banker to the world in that sense. Like you've just been in the nitty gritty of really understanding how these countries finance themselves, specifically, by the way, in this secondary market, as well as the first one as well. But in other words, they're trading this stuff. And often when countries are not doing well, just like if it didn't look like you were going to pay your mortgage on time, the debt starts trading for less and less, right? So then if you're a smart investor, you can come along and say, oh, I think you probably are going to pay that mortgage. So I'm going to buy up that loan for pennies on the dollar, and I'm going to collect your mortgage payment every month. I mean, it's the one way I can think of sort of explaining that.
I'd take it down to something a little bit more sort of something that people can relate to. Let's say you don't pay your credit card bills for 6 months, you default to your credit card, and then they sell it in a secondary market, which they do, or you don't pay your taxes, and somebody can go and take your house. They'll buy at the nominal claim of the debt. So they'll pay, let's say, 2 or 3 cents. You're sitting in your house. They come and they paid, $20,000 or $30,000 for $1 million house, and they take your house. And so what these secondary markets and sovereign debt do is give a channel to a disruptive actor who wants to act against our interests. Because the big difference for China is they have a sort of symbiotic relationship with us. They produce stuff, we buy it. They're interested in stability. Long term, they kind of want to displace us. The Russians, they just want to mess with us. I prefer to use another word, but
you're keeping it clean. You're keeping it clean. It saves me from having to go beep.
And the problem in DC is people don't really understand what the opportunity of the secondary markets happen. And if you look at a place like Ecuador or Ghana, they're really instrumental for the U.S. running operations of all sorts. If the economies of these countries get disrupted, it's really bad because it will make the background noise and the disruption could create some real havoc for our ability to do things.
Give me an example. So you say, okay, we're over there in Ghana. Or why are we there?
We are there.
What do you mean? Like what operations?
If you look at it, Western Africa, look at Burkina Faso, you have a lot of Islamic ISIS activity in the north of these countries. So the U.S. embassy there, obviously we need a base, a safe haven to sort of coordinate what we're doing to blunt, I guess in this day and age, we forget about Islamic terrorists, but they're really active in Africa. Yeah. And for us to be able to run these things, or a lot of the semi-terrorist drug operations, we need a foothold in a place like Ecuador, or in a place like Venezuela. Do we want to deliver withdraw so much that we allow countries for pennies on the dollar to step in and have a very strong, not just a disruptive presence, but a presence on our doorstep.
And look at the intention, and specifically, just because I'm familiar with it, Venezuela, I mean, we've restricted that secondary debt market so that basically, if you own the debt, as I understand it, you can sell it, but you can't buy it, like as an American, right? Like you can't go out and buy Venezuelan debt. So consequently, It reduces the number of buyers, the price sinks. If Russia's willing to buy it, well, then before you know it, they're going to be taking over PDVSA, and suddenly, right there in our backyard, you get a very large Russian presence, which I don't think really gels with the whole Monroe Doctrine thing in our hemisphere.
No, I would agree, and I do feel that our sanctions policy really does need to be rethought. I mean, we applied the same trading ban on Venezuelan bonds to Russian bonds. So there was a situation, I might get in trouble for saying this in public, but there was a situation where the Russians were going to have to pay coupon payments to Western creditors, including a lot of U.S. funds. Mm-hmm. And we decided that instead we would impose a secondary ban, force the Russians into default. And the Russians are actually pretty smart. They went through this post-98 in Ukraine.
Right. That was the Russian debt crisis. That was when they defaulted, but it was an internal default.
No, it was external as well.
Okay.
They defaulted on everything. They treated what they issued as the Russian Federation as different than the ex-Soviet stuff. Right. Again, I don't want to go too far in the weeds. Okay. But they did learn how to buy back bonds in the secondary market. Then going into the Ukraine situation, which I think that we made worse by not getting in front of it. I mean, as I've told you, I was in Ukraine in 2012, and the opinion of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine was that these Russian activists were like nutcases, and the United States just didn't manage it. They allowed the Russians to sort of move in there and get into the Donbass region. But at the same time they were doing this stuff, the Russians, there was a debt restructuring of Ukraine in 2014 that the Russians held out of, and they weaponized the secondary debt market to sue Ukraine. So in the case
wait, let me back up. So there was this bond, right, offering, and in the secondary market where it was traded after the fact, the Russians were there buying it up cheaply.
They bought a bit of it, and then there was about $3 billion that was primarily in Russia. But they learned to weaponize. They learned how to operate.
So then they were like, okay, well, we're in control because we hold your debt. We have your house, right? We can take your house if you don't play ball.
House in this case,
right?
But they didn't. I mean, I don't want to get too far in the weeds. They have to buy enough of it to actually take the house. So there's a certain percentage depending on each bond. But it's really funny because we're very, very well. I think everybody in the United States now knows who the Wagner Group is.
Yes.
Okay. So
I mean, everybody. I keep hearing about it, and then there's something about, like, I guess the chef at the Wagner Group is coming out saying this, that, and the other. And I'm like, this is funny that it's like part of like regular public conversation.
The Russians are running the equivalent in the financial markets under the surface that, via the secondary markets, are running the same kind of disruptive operations that the Wagner Group is running in the open. You look at Mali, where the Wagner Group has moved in. You have Wagner people in all the hot spots, but behind the scenes, you have a very sophisticated, you say what you want about the Russians, they're not dumb and they've learned. They're weaponizing stuff that we're not paying attention to.
Okay, so Ukraine debt being, I guess, I don't know how that's worth anything, frankly, now, Hans, right? Because the country's just a complete mess. But Venezuela, we know, is an example. Some places in Africa. So they're ratcheting it up, having more influence in a lot of places than we would certainly like. What's the answer for us? I mean, what should we be doing? How do we change this so that we limit their ability to disrupt?
I mean, I think it's a matter of just understanding the risks, and policymakers in the U.S., you get the sense that D.C. operates very well when there's a crisis, or it can operate reasonably well. But that there has to be a crisis before they really pay attention. It's not a secret that the decision-making process in D.C. is can be called inefficient. And what comes out the other end when it goes through the bureaucracy might not really be targeted. It'd be good to sort of, that there be a bit more financial expertise in the echo chamber there to foresee risks. And also, I would say net, you're overreacting to China on their primary lending. You're really creating so much stuff and so much narrative that sort of on the surface you're demonizing the Chinese, be that as it may, but they'll back off and it's hard to negotiate. And then there's a blind spot. Like fundamentally, if I spent 2 or 3 minutes with just about anybody who watches your program and explain primary, secondary markets, they're going to understand it. It'd be good if people in DC have that kind of ability as well, because there's a leveraged way. Leverage means you can literally use something and with less force get the same effect on the other end. But the guys who are pushing on that lever are people with their intent is to disrupt us. The Chinese might do it at some level. The Russians are full on now. We can debate why and how we got here with Russia. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm an American. These guys are working against me.
Well, I mean, and you're tapping into something that has been a frustration of mine forever, and that's that you don't really have people that understand a ton when it comes to finance and economics. They understand politics and they like politics, and I've seen it in the media business as well. And so what you're asking them to do is pretty darn critical, and it almost feels like you mentioned a weaponization. It's almost like there needs to be a militarization, if you would, of understanding the importance of debt markets, sovereign debt markets, secondary markets, and saying, okay, we need to get serious about this because this is very much affecting our position in the world. So there's kind of a military, if you would, component to it, right? A national security component that may be overlooked because, I don't know, you say secondary debt markets, like, woo, what's she talking about? What's he talking about? It's like scary stuff. But the truth is, it really matters. And if we don't have people that get it, that's actually a pretty dangerous thing.
Yeah, I think it's important that we sort of put this out in the open. I think it's also important to realize that at the same time, we should be making rational moves as a country to maintain our status as a financial center, the confidence. This all ties in with the possibility of us defaulting. We don't want to give away what built us up to be what we are today. And you can say the world isn't like it was in 1993, where we're the one superpower. We have more competition now, but be thoughtful about protecting the advantages we have. Yeah. Russia, China, they can't duplicate what we've done. I mean, we are quicker at solving problems in the financial world than anybody else. Our system adjusts much more quickly. But think about the financial system on every single level and be paranoid about what doors you might be leaving open inadvertently.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it feels like there are quite a few open. And as you said, the Russians learned how to deal with this, with their own debt crisis. And we haven't, for whatever reason, it sounds fair to say, like, for whatever reason, we haven't fully just digested how we can use these tools. And we ought to be able to, because frankly, Hans, we still got the best financial markets in the world. I mean, everybody wants to come to Wall Street for an IPO. We are still, despite the insanity at the Fed, et cetera, and inflation, et cetera, we are the envy of the world in terms of our financial markets. So we have the brain power, we have the people. It's just they're not in the State Department, I guess.
I would agree that, it feels like for the last, I don't know how long, we have been taking actions that are really counterproductive to maintain our status on this side. And, we might be playing with matches and risking burning the house down. We just have to be aware that there's some people on the outside with a sort of a bucket of gasoline, happy to pour it on as soon as the one match lights. So,
yeah,
we're doing it
for sure. Hey, really quick, just because, you've seen your share of really messed up places. I know you've spent a lot of time on the ground in a lot of these places. And like I said, you've tried to sort of reposition their sovereign debt markets so that maybe they have some chance. when you consider how dysfunctional they are from a political perspective and you compare and contrast it with the US, look, we're still great. We're prettiest girl at the dance. I get it all. But nonetheless, what do you think is happening? I mean, does it feel worse now than ever before? Does it feel better? I mean, how do you compare and contrast what goes on here in the US with some of the worst places? And gosh, I mean, you've been everywhere, right? Restructuring debt in, I know, Argentina, Venezuela. You were the only American on the Greek steering committee in that whole European debt crisis, a whole slew of places in Africa. I mean, you can name them better than me, but when you think of what we're going through and what they went through, what's the difference?
Yeah, I have to say, in this age of sort of instant communication, the world is becoming aware that we could be as dysfunctional as anybody else. I mean, it's sort of funny. I used to have a good collection of defaulted U.S. bonds that I put up in some of the meeting rooms to remind emerging market country finance ministers that all the defaults, when we were starting out, we did better. So post-Revolutionary War, post-Civil War, the U.S. defaulted in ways that countries are just catching up. Our innovation...
Really? I mean, I've never really thought about that, because you just think of the U.S. as just such this, credit, like, war horse, right? Like, we are just so strong.
I think that Alexander Hamilton, in deciding to sort of incorporate all the state debts and pay them off at par, may have created a sort of moral hazard precedent, but basically provided the foundation. I mean, the defaults that happened on the state level post-Civil War were different. It was outside the federal charter, so it was sort of buyer beware. The buyers of that, we said that these states were operating illegally, you get nothing. Mm-hmm. But it's, I think that there's still a real feeling everywhere you go that we have a big advantage, that, we might suck, but we suck less than the other guys. And there is culturally just such an affinity, whether you go to Caracas or Tehran, that people like us, despite all the noise that we get on the surface. And there's a respect for the American dream.
Yes, which is rare, and you will not find anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to go to... It's like people will deal with these other countries because they kind of have to, but we, I don't want to get into we don't lead with our national interests. And I think that at a certain point that our foreign policy should be a little bit more transparent. We always try to code it. Wow, I'm really going to get in trouble. Human rights, this and that. I mean, just be open about why we're doing stuff. I think people would respect.
No, I mean, I remember, I won't say his name, but there was an energy analyst, oil analyst, big deal, who once said, I remember when we were going into Iraq, and Iraq obviously not being a very popular war, especially now, of course, but he said, well, what do you think this is about? It's about oil. That's it, right? Like, and, there's a reason why we're in some countries and not in others. And to your point, maybe the transparency. I've often said with Venezuela, look, I know we don't like their socialist system. Let's try and help them with that. But for goodness sakes, I mean, they're right there in our country. They're a very similar culture to us. We ought to be able to think this through, because you know what? They matter. They're sitting on more oil than Saudi Arabia. So, hey, guess what? It is about that.
The limited experience of Chevron getting a license to do business in Venezuela has forced the Venezuelan system to start operating in a more transparent ways. There's been a huge shakeup in PDVSA. Everybody who's in the business community there is like, wow, great, let's do more of this. And meanwhile, we're sort of, trying to manage the perceptions of political risk. That's fine. I mean, it feels like it might be going in the right direction. It's just, think about aligning our national interest with the national interest of the populations, and it becomes a bit clearer. I mean, we have a lot of political forces that are in play in this country, and a lot of different interests. It would be nice if we could just
look out for us.
Can I say
look out for
first?
us?
Just lead with what's in our interest, because you know what? We bring a lot of good things. I mean, sure, there's complications politically. We may not manage certain things particularly well, but most people want to deal with American companies.
Yeah, I gotcha. That's why we need a little bit more business in Washington, people with a business background. Anyway, hey, it's great to see you, my friend Hans Humes. Like, you are the guy. So we feel very lucky to have you on the show today. I really just think you've got a super grasp on everything that's going on globally, and your interests are for the U.S. and the success of the U.S. So I encourage people. You're on Twitter. They can follow you on Twitter. So really check out Hans Humes on Twitter. Yeah. Hey, thank you. Thank you again. It's great to see you.
I want to say one last word, Trish. All my skills I've learned through these 35 years will not serve in any way, shape, or form if the U.S. defaults. Wow. Nobody will put those pieces back together.
Man, he's right? Like if the U.S. defaults, thanks to Hans Humes, by the way. Interesting guy, interesting interview. I appreciate everybody's patience because I can wonk out with the best of them, right? And again, don't forget, my own financial background. So I think that one of the things that really does frustrate me the most about politicians is that they just care about politics and they don't understand or appreciate the financial tools that they have in their arsenal. I will credit Donald Trump with this. He understood the power of the US dollar. He understood the power of the financial markets. He understood the power of us saying, hey, China, you know what? We don't like this. And if you don't stop, we're going to sanction you. Like, there you go. And to me, we ought to be able to use all the financial tools we have in our arsenal in order, if we make a decision, this is what we want. And look, you can have the whole debate. Maybe we don't want to be the hegemonic power. I would still say, there's a whole lot of good that goes along with being that hegemonic power because you are the world's reserve currency and we enjoy a better lifestyle. Full stop because of it. But it does mean that you, instead of like saying, okay, well, we're going to run off with our tanks, and you need that, by the way, in the background. You don't need, where is she, Navy girl, right? We don't need this. Like, that is not how we're going to win wars. It's not about having green energy fleets that are going to be in the desert somewhere in the Middle East. That is not really a solution, but we need a strong military and we need people that understand global finance in a way that this crew clearly doesn't get. If you want to talk about a crew that doesn't get anything, hey, we haven't even gotten into Antony Blinken yet, our Secretary of State. Consider the allegations against Mr. Blinken. Don't forget, there were 51 former spies and political hacks, basically, that came out and said that Hunter Biden laptop was misinformation. Same cast of characters, by the way, that told us for sure Trump had been compromised by the Russians because, they had that proof with that so-called dossier. And yet, what happened? Oh, it was just the inverse of that. So the dossier was fake. The laptop was real. Think of what went down. And according to Mike Morrell, right, former bigwig at the CIA, that letter that was put out by the 51 former spies, that was orchestrated at the request of our current Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, a guy who I guarantee you does not understand two bits of what we just talked about right there. Our State Department isn't thinking about how we affect countries from an economic standpoint. And the economy is everything. It really is. I think this is why Joe Biden is probably going to get voted out of office. You just can't have this much inflation and this bad of an economy. We got a decent jobs number today, but it's not enough. And if anything, it's actually one of those things that the Fed is going to freak out because now they know that, okay, we're going to have more inflation. Well, how are you going to fight inflation now? You're going into an election year. I don't think Joe Biden's going to appreciate it very much. Or your former boss there at the Federal Reserve, Mr. Jerome Powell, if Janet Yellen sees that you are raising rates at a time when we're going into an election, that's not going to go over well. They hate that. They absolutely hate that. And they think that that's going to tank the economy. But simultaneously, because they were unwilling to actually have their medicine when they needed to have it, we are now in the inflation scenario we're in right now. And so this is like Carter on steroids. we are going to see stagflation. I've called this from the beginning. If you were watching or listening to my show back in, August 2020 when we started this, I told you inflation is going to be double digits. I was right. Producer prices, they went up to upwards of 11% of an increase. Look, we're still dealing with about 5% inflation right now. And if you really want to drill down and look at those numbers, it's probably even higher because they changed the way we calculate inflation. So it's actually probably far more similar to what we saw back in the 80s. Guys, I want to try something. So I'm looking at all your comments and I see, I'm still relatively new to all this. So new to a lot of technology. like a computer. Anyway, I'm looking at it and I'm seeing your comments and I'm wondering if I can put them up on the screen. It says add to broadcast. Does that work? Wow. Well, that's neat, except for some reason it's in black. Well, I'm just playing around here. This is interesting. I'm looking at the comments and Jonathan, it's great to have you here tonight. We have somebody who's saying, and this is interesting. Again, I don't think I can quite show these the way I had wanted to. I don't know as they're showing up on the screen so well for you guys, but once BRICS make their own currency, you could kiss the dollar goodbye. Maybe. I mean, I would say this, let's be very clear. If you had a choice to buy the Brazilian real or the Chinese yuan or the US dollar, I mean, I still kind of, I still think I'd rather have the US dollar. But of course, if we default on it, forget about it. If we're defaulting on our debt, then everything's going to change. And I don't think that will really happen. I certainly hope not. And again, it's just, Jonathan, you're so sweet. Thank you. I hope I do. I do have a lot of empathy for a lot of people. And I think it's important. I think we have to bring that to the table as journalists. And while I have my opinion and, I've always considered myself, I'll say this, independent, right? In the sense that I just want, and I mean this, what's best for America and best for the American people. And if we don't get that, if we can't ensure that our leadership is helping us to prosper and creating a better life for our children, then we've got real problems. So I often think, I look back on 2016 and how Donald Trump came out and you had people that had been historically always in the Democrat Party and suddenly they weren't Democrats anymore. They were voting for Donald Trump. And that was because he was talking about policies that were relevant to them. And so I do say this, and by the way, he used to be a Democrat. Right? He was a registered Democrat and I do believe the Clintons were at his wedding. So I mention this only because we are very much in these lanes politically. I've never considered myself uber conservative, but it's almost like every day goes by and they want to tell me that somehow men should compete against women, biologically born men, and it just depends on how you feel that day. I mean, that's what I'm like, wow, am I that out there? Am I that extreme on the right? When I just say, wait a second, I remember looking at that dossier, I read it and I'm like, this is reading like opposition research to me. This isn't reading like an intelligence document. And you somehow were like immediately, okay, you can't ask these questions because they've ratcheted up the rhetoric and they are so against conservatives and frankly Trump. Like that's what this but it's not even just Trump. He's his own special breed, right? And he called them all out. I told you the other day how Biden, he's already spent $50 billion on consultants since he got there. $50 billion, guys. I mean, that is one heck of a lot of money. Trump spent like $62 or $60 billion in his entire 4 years. So basically, Joe Biden has spent almost as much in 27 months. And I'm like, okay, no wonder the establishment likes him. All these great consulting companies, they're like ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. And Trump didn't do that. The other thing is that he just saw things with a point of view that was not so cool with the establishment. And then, he had his way about him, which they also didn't like. And so all that contributed to things. But don't forget, like, this is not just him. Think about what they did to Mitt Romney. Okay, I know we don't have a lot of Romney fans out there, but this was a guy who said, hey, Russia's an issue, and Barack Obama told him to go take his 1980s policy back. Remember that in the debate? And then, of course, it was Barack Obama that allowed Crimea to go to Russia. So I think there was a total failure of diplomacy this time around. I'm not impressed with Antony Blinken. I don't think any of these people understand the arsenal that they have at their disposal vis-a-vis the secondary debt markets. In other words, we can do a whole lot more there, and yet we're letting Russia and China and these other countries like beat us at our own game. We should be, we're the financial leader of the world, we should be all over this. Like, we should understand this. We should have leaders that totally get it, and we don't. And I don't even think that they could tell you, what GDP, gross domestic product, is. I don't think they could really kind of give you any data on what's actually going on. So we were going to talk about like political candidates. I mean, when I look at the landscape right now, it's still early, and I have to be careful about not, being overly for one person or another. I have my biases, of course, and I'll just share with you that my biases are for the people that understand the policy, that understand business, that understand our economy, that understand taxes, that understand global relations, that understand the importance of diplomacy, that understand before we start sending a bunch of troops anywhere or we start bankrolling wars, like, we ought to use every diplomatic effort we can possibly consider, and we ought to use our financial arsenal. I mean, hey, we were sanctioning Russia, but we weren't. We were like, okay, we're sanctioning Russia, and yet we're going to allow all our trade partners to continue trading with them. So Russia's doing fine. Like, Russia, and one of the things that Hans and I have talked about in the past, I mean, they're flush with cash. KT McFarland was on the show just a few days ago, a former Kissinger protege, actually. So she's pretty steeped in the State Department. We ought to ask her. She's former Navy, too. I got to ask her what she thinks about the new Navy recruiter. Anyway, KT also making this point. The Russians are doing fine. Like, oil prices went up. They're doing great. They've been able to manage. And then they're out there buying parts of countries, bridges and oil fields. And we're like, whoa, what? Because we don't even know what secondary debt markets are. These idiots in Washington, they have no clue. And you know what? I'm going to get like all worked up, so I'm going to try and calm myself. But I am blown away by their lack of knowledge. Really, it's a lack of sophistication, and they don't even want to learn it. Like, I can remember sort of in my early days reporting, and I was a general assignment correspondent, but I had this specialty in economics, obviously. And I get like really into, okay, the Federal Reserve is coming out with an interest rate hike or cut or whatever today. And I'd love to like talk about the policy of it. And it would be like a great story. And all the producers were like, oh my God, no. Because nobody wanted to do it. All they wanted to talk about was politics. That was it. And I guess my point is just that the American people deserve better, because ultimately the economy controls everything. So if we don't have people in Washington, D.C. that have any knowledge about any of the things that you just heard my guests talking about, and they don't, if they're not even willing to listen to that or understand it, then we're going to be at a huge disadvantage for years to come. And yes, one of you was talking earlier about the threat of, the potential for China or one of the other BRIC nations taking over our place in the world, right, as the number one sort of currency, the number one place to be, the safety center. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, but I think if we don't actually get serious about this, then there's a real shot that it could happen in the future. And between the social nonsense, between the absolute unwillingness to understand what is at stake from an economic and military perspective, clearly, and again, I mean, this just says it all, right? Clearly, if this is who you're using to recruit your military, I'm sure that's just great for morale. Then you got problems. Okay, quickly on the Fox stuff. People have been asking me, of course, about Tucker Carlson because, I was also sort of unceremoniously in a similar situation. I think, I obviously was in a different situation, but I'm sure kind of caught him by surprise. And I would just say that he's going to be great. He's going to do just fine. He's got a big career ahead of him. He can speak to you directly. He actually did a speech, I think, in Alabama today, and everybody was very curious to see what he had to say, and he's going to be fine, so don't worry about him. You might want to be watching Fox. So let me just see where it traded today. We started the program talking about shares of Bud, Anheuser-Busch, ticker symbol BUD, which traded down 1.62% today for $64.83 a share. As I look at it, it's just unbelievable because it just is a mess, such a mess, and such a shame, really. But that's what you get when you get a bunch of woke people running the place. But let me take a look at Fox, and we'll see where their stock is today, whether or not, and they've recovered a bit. So there you go. Okay, they're up 2.6%. As I said, they're a very diverse company. So they get a whole lot of other stuff that effectively prints money, and they do make a lot of money. And now they get the Dominion thing behind them. I do think that Smartmatic will be a thorn in their side, and it's not easy when you lose your main anchor. And for me, perhaps it was different because hey, they had that 8 o'clock show over on Fox News. Effectively, I was sort of competing with it. And so many of you were like, oh yeah, I go back and forth between the two of you. Lou Dobbs was on before me. They've lost him. Dan Bongino, just a phenomenal guy. They've lost him. I mean, there's just a lot of people. And so talent is a tricky thing. I'm going to say this because it's very hard to find good talent. It's hard to find people that relate to an audience, that have a rapport with an audience. And so finding someone to take that spot is going to be quite a challenge, and their ratings are likely to suffer in the near term. Anyway, so much going on. Thank you. You guys are like, oh yeah, you should do this like live more often and maybe at an earlier hour. Well, we have people on the West Coast, don't we? Right? We get a few people out there on the West Coast. If you are watching on the West Coast, that's great because it's way earlier out there. Anyway, I love having you here. I appreciate all the support. You have just been wonderful, and I can't thank you enough for that. Please, if you haven't, do make sure that you subscribe to the channel, that you pass along the word. We're here with lots and lots and lots and lots of video every single day. We make sure that we send it all your way. And I think if nothing else, you will be a smarter, more informed person, and hopefully will care as passionately, I'm sure you all do, about all of these issues as much as I do. And thank you again. It's really neat. It's really neat to have this conversation. So I'll see you tomorrow. Okay. Have a good one, everyone. Take care.